Okay, here we go. Chapter 27, Section 2 is World War One. Alright, so our objectives: compare and contrast the Eastern Front and the Western Front of the war. Identify the effects of new technologies on warfare. Now, I alluded to a couple of these in the last video. Good stuff. Good stuff to learn. Alright, so the two different fronts in Europe here. Alright, so the Schlieffen Plan, if you remember that, basically the Schlieffen Plan was the German plan to take over France and Russia in about 6 months, or till Christmas. They thought that the war would be over in no time, because they thought they would go conquer everybody, nobody would resist or fight back, and then they could just go on living their lives. Now, the plan was to sweep around Paris and surround the French army. Now, I got a map of this, so I'll show you this here on the next slide. The plan was halted by the First Battle of the Marne, which was from September 6th through the 10th. Now, this is the First Battle of the Marne. The Marne was a river that ran through France. Now, what happens is that there's going to be some stalling, and it's going to turn into a stalemate on the Western Front. Trench warfare characterized the West in World War One. The trenches went from the English Channel to Switzerland. So what they're doing is all up along Europe, up and down Europe. On this side, Western Europe, there were trenches, and you could tell if it was a German trench, a trench that belonged to the British, or a trench that belonged to the French, because there was different ways that they built them, different characteristics. There's lots of good stuff out there about trench warfare. If you want to see that or look at it, just Google it. There's a lot of stuff. There's lots of movies that depict it. The new movie that's out, that 1917, does a really good job with the trench warfare and kind of what World War One was like. I highly recommend it. Now, Russia in the East was marked by mobility, so they're constantly moving around, chasing each other, total opposite of what was happening in the West. And the Russians were defeated at the Battle of Tannenberg and the Battle of Moserin Lake. So basically the Russians, this is up north more in Russia, they were kind of having struggles with their own people, and trying to fight a battle against the Germans was tough, and they lost 2 consecutive battles, and this doesn't bode well for the Russians staying in the war. The Russians will eventually leave to have the Russian Revolution, and that's why another part of the reason why the United States actually joins World War One. Alright, so here's the Schlieffen Plan, in the West anyway. So you can see up here, okay, Paris is right here, okay, and what they're trying to do is they're just trying to flank and go through this way, okay, and then, but what happens is the people of Brussels and Belgium, they're going to come and they're going to resist a little bit, and what's going to happen is these lines are actually going to get down this way and then up and around. This one will never be able to flank Paris, and there's going to be right here is the Marne, okay, so where that goes through, it turns into the Marne goes this way, and then the Seine goes through that way, goes through Paris. But anyway, they won't actually get this far. They'll have to go around, and they'll never get to Paris, which is a big difference between the First World War and the Second World War. Alright, here's what some of the trenches look like. On the left there, you can tell that is Germans because of their hats. Down here, you can tell that those are probably British, I would say. Each country had their kind of own unique hats. on what they look like, also their colors that they wore. The Germans wore black, and the French were blue, and the British were red, and the Americans were green. Okay, this is called No Man's Land. Right there, No Man's Land. Basically, between the trenches, there was stretches of land, and there would be lots of not bombings, but there would be mines that were dropped or that were in there. They throw grenades, constantly shooting. There's barbed wire everywhere. There's holes, and there's water, and trees are destroyed. World War I devastates Europe when it's all said and done. 4 years of constant fighting. Europe is in ruin after this. Oh, yeah, okay, that's a trench foot. It's not pleasant. So if you don't like this, you're going to have to close your eyes for like 30 seconds or fast forward. Trench foot was pretty common because life in the trenches was rough. It was raining all the time, and you didn't get to change your socks every day or change your boots, and your feet would get a bunch of stuff on it, as you can see there. Okay. Hopefully everybody's grossed out. Now, Italy, if you remember from Section 1, their allegiance changes in the fact that they go from being part of the Triple Alliance to being part of the Allies. The Triple Alliance, remember, was Italy, Germany, and Austria-Hungary. But the Italians, don't agree with everything that the Germans are doing, so they switch and go to the side of the Allies with Great Britain, France, Russia, and the United States eventually. Russia will drop out, the U.S. will come in. Alright, now, there wasn't only fighting in the trenches, there was also fighting through the air, which I mentioned in Section 1. The elaborate systems for trench protection, so like I said, there was barbed wires, there were machine gun nests, and heavy artillery all over. The trenches were built in unique ways, and there was different ways that they did it, but they all basically had the same kind of ideas. No Man's Land, I showed you that picture of that already. That was where nobody went. That's where a lot of the bombings were, for a lot of the grenade throwing, and that's where all the guns were pointed at. It was just the area between enemy trenches. Massive casualties. World War I turned into a war of attrition. That means a war based on wearing down the other side with constant attacks and heavy losses. Now, casualties doesn't just refer to deaths. It also refers to people who are wounded, missing, or prisoners of war. Those are all included in casualties. Now, airplanes and zeppelins. Planes appeared for the first time in 1915 and were used to find enemies and take out communication lines. Now, how these trenches communicated with each other is that there were telephone lines that went between the trenches. And so what they were trying to do is they were trying to figure out where these communication lines were at, and then they would come, and the planes would come, and they'd drop, and they'd try to blow up the telephone lines, the communication lines, during this time. Germans used Zeppelins to bomb the enemy. They were ineffective once it was discovered that they were filled with hydrogen gas. Zeppelins are just really big blimps, is the way to look at it. And a famous one that blew up was the Hindenburg, that actually blew up in New York. It hit a building, since it's filled with hydrogen. It was very combustible, one little spark, and the whole thing went up. Once people figured this out, they would just shoot at Zeppelins until they either went away or exploded. Alright, so here's some pictures. The red with the black cross there, that's German planes. The one on the top, the white one there, that one is a French plane. And then there's what a Zeppelin looks like. Okay, why do you think World War I was the largest scale conflict in which trench warfare was used? Well, it's because there was new technologies that made trench warfare obsolete. Planes could attack the trenches from above. Tanks were relatively impervious to machine gun fire, which means shooting at a tank didn't really do much and could push through enemy lines. Tanks also become very important. The Germans probably have the best tanks in the world at this time. But the problem is that it took Germans longer to build the tanks than were being destroyed, whereas the Allies were able to make tanks quicker. They might not have been as good, but they had more of them, and there's always strength in numbers. So they were able to push through better. Now the war is going to start to widen. Bulgaria enters on the Central Powers side. Bulgaria is down. It's over down there by the Ottoman Empire, Turkey. The Allies tried to take Gallipoli in the Ottoman Empire, but failed. That was a major battle. Basically, if they could take that part of Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire, then they could start to work their way and take the rest. But they failed there because the Ottomans knew that they were coming, and so they were unable to take that and suffered losses. Now, outside of Europe, Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence of Arabia was British, and he encouraged Arab princes to revolt against the Ottoman Empire. Basically, what he did is he went and learned all about the Arab culture and saw that what the Ottomans were doing was not great. So he told the Arab princes to overthrow the Ottoman Empire. British troops also mobilized in India, Australia, and New Zealand. So Britain had all of these as colonies, and they mobilized all the troops in these places to get ready to go fight a war. Japan seized a number of German-held islands in the Pacific, so Japan and Germany were actually on opposite sides during this war. But in World War II, they will be together. Japan didn't like that the Germans were getting closer to their land, and Japan was also trying to deal with China, so they'd go and just take all the lands that the Germans had in the Pacific. Now, the United States enters the war because the Germans made them mad, pretty much. Up to this point, the U.S. is trying to stay neutral. They want to not interfere because a lot of the immigrants that are coming to the U.S. at this time are from these countries, and it's hard to go fight against family, which is why we wanted to stay out of it. But the British blockaded the Germans, but the Germans used unrestricted submarine warfare to sink passenger lines. The Germans also had really good submarines called U-boats. And what they did is they were going and they were attacking any kind of vessels that they wanted to. But the problem was that some of those vessels had just regular people on them. And the Germans promised that they would not attack any ships that were coming in that had people on it, but they go back on that. And on May 7th, 1915, the Lusitania was sunk, and 100 Americans were killed. This made the United States very angry because now Americans had died as a result of this war. And now we're thinking about, okay, we need to start to get involved. The U.S. officially enters April 1917. When it enters, that means they actually send troops. Up till then, they had been sending supplies to the Allies to help them build more things and be ready and feed the soldiers and all that good stuff. But in April 1917, we enter the war. So from April, and then it ends in 1918, so about a year and a half. All right, so that's Lawrence of Arabia up there. And then that is the sinking of the Lusitania down there. Lawrence of Arabia, there's a couple movies out there. They're not bad, but they're pretty long. So, and the first one was made in the 1950s. So, okay, how did German policy of unrestricted submarine warfare lead to the entry of the U.S.? We protest the policy. After sinking the Lusitania, they resumed this policy in 1917 in order to blockade the Great Britain. The U.S. joins it. So after they blow it up, they say they're not going to do it anymore. Then they go back on it, do it anyway, and then that's when we get mad and join the Allies. Now, World War I is considered a total war because the government has to get involved. Many thought the war would be short, like I have mentioned, but after it goes on for a while, governments have to take over. They have to have drafts, put aside their economies, ration their food, regulate imports and exports, and take over industries. The government has to control everything. Okay, and the thing is that the government will only control it as long as they need to. Then they'll give it back and go back to the way things were. This whole idea of the government taking over is called a planned economy. And by 1916, people's morale was beginning to break. They thought this war is never going to be over. It's been going on for 2 years. Nothing's really happening. And they think this is going to last who knows how long. People were arrested for protesting because you need to have the people fight for what you believe in as a country, even if they don't. They need to get on board. Newspapers were censored. New posters had to be used to get morale back up, propaganda posters to say that this is not a losing effort, we're going to win, look at these Germans, we can defeat them, etc. Alright, so here's some. This is the most famous one probably out of the United States. I want you for U.S. Army. That's Uncle Sam. That you could tell is against the Germans because they got that pointy thing on their head. That was famous of the Germans. Women, help American sons win the war by taking out government bonds. And then this one down here is, of course I can. I'm patriotic as can be, and ration points won't worry me. So that was just referring to them rationing the food they were eating. Okay, why might a war of attrition lead to a total war? Well, in order to make a war of attrition possible, a government may need to marshal all the resources it can. So marshal just means take control of. To do so, it is likely that the war will become a total war, because once the government starts to take over stuff, it's just going to turn into the government takes over everything. Now, women were very important to this war, and I would argue that World War I would not have been won without the efforts of women. Because they have some new occupations. They take over jobs that men had held before, but they got drafted, so the women had to do it. Now, the difference was that many women lost their jobs because the men just assumed that they would get their old jobs back. You could go both ways for the arguments of yes or no on why that should be a positive or a negative. Yes, they should get their jobs back because they had them before and didn't have a choice to go fight for the war. No, They shouldn't have to take them away from women because if they've been working and doing a good job, they deserve to make the wage. But you also have to remember the time period here. Okay, women are fighting for rights, working in different jobs that aren't feminine, right? They're more masculine jobs, and so it's a tough ethical dilemma. Some social and political gains. Many countries passed voting rights for women. So after the war, there's a lot of women's suffrage that is going to go on. Remember, that is voting rights for women. That is a good thing. Okay, that is a good thing during this time. They also start to get jobs. Maybe they create some new jobs for women. They start to live on their own. It's okay for them to live on their own, be divorced, have their own land, own their own house or whatever. And they have a new independence to just be that strong, independent woman that they want to be. Okay, they were granted the right to vote following World War I because they had proven that they could do traditionally masculine jobs by filling the jobs that the men were doing. All right, so that is section 2. It's kind of just a short summary. It's only 21-minute summary there. I could go on for hours and hours about this stuff, but that will be all for this one. Section 3 is the Russian Revolution. I'm pretty sure. So we will talk about that and how that affects the landscape of Europe.